restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
The president spoke, the nation listened, and now the nation is reacting. Don Lemon joins us now live from New York's Times Square. And Don, we've already been hearing reaction coming in from all over the world, different countries, some in support, some strongly against this military action that started. Let's localize that reaction, though. What are people saying as far as President Bush's speech that they heard and as far as the start of war?
Well, really, the reaction here in Times Square has been mixed, and of course, the concern was people speaking out against the war. There's been some support, but there's also been some dissent. And the concern was that people may use an airstrike against Baghdad to do some sort of terroristic act here in Times Square, here in New York City. And of course, the mayor of New York and the police commissioner said they would take care of any of that by putting into place what they call Operation Atlas, which they say is the most comprehensive anti-terrorism operation that any city in America has undertaken. Operation Atlas calls for increased patrols in certain areas, increased securities at places of worship and tourist spots, and also at financial institutions, also increased checkpoints on bridges and other places of entry throughout the city. And joining me now, two of New York City's finest, who are both part of the Operation Atlas. You guys normally work in the Bronx, right? We have Officer Vasquez and Officer Maldonado. You normally work in the Bronx, but you're here now doing this. Tell me what you guys are doing tonight. You're in a van, you say?
Right now we're part of COBRA team, which is the Chemical or Biological Response Team. And we're here for omnipresence, and we're going from landmark to landmark and from area to area, making sure everything's all right.
You said if anybody had any concerns about coming to New York City about the safety or about terrorism, they shouldn't be.
Well, the manpower and police and presence of us, it's enormous. There's a lot of manpower down here. I would be safe.
Yeah.
I would feel safe.
Thank you. Officer Maldonado, you said you guys heard about it. You were listening to it where, on the radio?
Yes.
What was your reaction when you heard about the airstrikes?
A little bit surprised it was so soon. I was expecting maybe it was in the next few days. But, you know, I knew it was going to hear about it. It was going to come eventually.
Yeah. So you said you were surprised by that it happened so quickly. Did it put you on a heightened sense of alert or make you a little bit more anxious about doing your job?
You know, it pretty much heard it right after the president spoke, and you know, I would think, you know, it would have been taking a little more time, but you know, we're here, we're ready, so. You know, that's why we're out here tonight.
Yeah, it seems like most people were not concerned about any terrorism because Times Square was full today at rush hour, was full during theater time, and even after the theater, after the president came out, people were watching him on the Jumbotron over there. So it seems like it didn't affect tourism or people going out to enjoy themselves, and that's probably because of you guys. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We want to talk about some of the reaction that people had earlier tonight. We talked to some people in Times Square. One woman who was from Manhattan, Kansas. She has a son who is away in the Middle East now fighting, and here's what she had to say.
We all pretty much expected that something would probably come down tonight or tomorrow.
Yeah. What's the reaction of the folks you're with?
Oh, all surprised, all concerned, all sort of a sense of inevitability. I think everybody knew that we were headed in this direction, and so just concerned now for our troops who are there and for our nation.
And obviously that's a concern from everyone, concerned about the safety of the people there and concerned about the safety of the nation. Of course, you heard the New York City police officer saying that everything is fine here. The mayor saying just yesterday, or just this morning actually, at the White House that in any city in America, in any city in the country, if you're going to be safe, it's going to be in New York City because of the amount of manpower and the precautions that they have taken. Back to you, Bianca.
One quick question. You're talking about the amount of manpower, increased patrols in that area. Anything different than what we might have been seeing before in other heightened states of alert, maybe different kind of equipment that they're now using?
Well, what you see now really in Times Square as well as other tourist attractions throughout the city, you see more police presence. You'll see bomb-sniffing dogs, some of the things they have out now. You'll see members of the National Guard on patrol. Also, these are things that you may not see, and other ways that the police department and the city of New York is helping. What they're doing is they're providing air monitoring systems at street level throughout the city, and also those Cobra teams and those Hammer teams that you heard the police officers talk about. Those are people who are specialists who are trained in chemical, biological, and radiological attacks. And like, as I said, those radiation sensors placed throughout the city. Also, the police officers just telling me just a short while ago that they have radiation sensors in their pagers, so they have it on their persons and also at certain sites throughout the city. So you'll see that, you'll see those bomb-sniffing dogs, and really just an increased police presence.
All right, Don Lemon in Times Square, thank you very much for that report. And Sam, he was just telling us about local reaction, people who were gathered there watching the president's speech, people feeling, you know, the pressure there, increased security in New York City, other major cities around the nation. I think it's interesting to hear the reaction coming in from around the world. Indonesia already saying they fiercely oppose this. The UK coming out and saying that Britain had no involvement in this attack at all. Russia's prime minister saying that he regrets this military action.
There is also word from the top defense official from Great Britain who says it is not long now until there will be a wider attack in Iraq. And as you mentioned, the word is coming out that Great Britain had nothing to do with this initial attack, but we assume, of course, they will be involved in subsequent attacks. And from Indonesia, there is this. Indonesia, by the way, is the world's most populous Muslim nation, and the president of Indonesia has now come out, and they are very strongly opposed to this U.S.-led attack on Iraq, and they now are urging the United Nations to call an emergency meeting. And also we are hearing from Germany.
The same thing
their
today.
parliament wants to get together in a very short period of time here on this Thursday and discuss this. They have strong opposition as well. So we are getting world reaction from all around the globe.
And we will, of course, continue to monitor this, bringing you the very latest. Stay with MSNBC.
Those are the latest pictures that we have from the Gulf region, and that is quite clearly a missile launch that was headed towards Iraq much earlier. It was about 9:30 East Coast time when the bombing began. There was a surprise attack near Baghdad, a bunker. They had a bunker buster bomb that they dropped, a tremendous bomb which was dropped in the skies over Baghdad. Because at the time, U.S. intelligence had indicated that some top Iraqi military officials may have been hunkered down in this bunker, so they decided on a surprise attack. So the war has clearly begun, and now we are in the lull. Military officials and analysts now say that there will be another attack. It very likely will happen within the next hours, and it sounds like, Bianca, it will be a very fierce and awesome attack.
Okay, and let's go and take a look at the latest headlines right now. 90 minutes after the 8 p.m. Eastern deadline to Saddam, bombs, as you saw, fell on Baghdad as the U.S. targeted the Iraqi president and Iraqi leadership. Working on specific intelligence, B-117 bombers dropped bunker busters on a target in Baghdad. No damage assessment as of yet. And now Sky News in London reporting that troops in North Kuwait, they've been instructed to put on gas masks in that area. Short time after the first strike, President Bush addressed the nation saying the bombing had started. He also warned that the conflict with Iraq would be longer and more difficult than some people had predicted. Meanwhile, Iraqis heard from defiant Saddam Hussein. He went on Iraqi television to accuse the U.S. of committing a shameful crime. And he also called on the people of Iraq to draw their sword and confront the invaders. We will, of course, recap the latest headlines in the Iraq crisis for you every 15 minutes at the top of the hour. Sam.
Thanks a lot, Bianca. And while those attacks were being conducted, just one note before we head to Carl Rochelle over at the Pentagon, about 1,000 U.S. troops in southern Afghanistan were conducting raids looking for members of al-Qaeda. This was almost transpiring at about the same time the bombing began in Iraq. So U.S. troops very, very busy all across the globe. Let's head to the Pentagon right now. Carl Rochelle standing by. And Carl, we are presumably in the lull right now, are we not?
Sam, that is the case, apparently in the lull now, although I was cautioned that don't rule out any daytime attacks because, of course, you can fire cruise missiles, either air-launched cruise missiles or Tomahawk cruise missiles in the daytime. They're unmanned, puts no one at risk if they can be seen. Extremely difficult to shoot down. You can see them, but they're very small targets and move at about the speed of an airliner. It uses an air-breathing jet engine to run them in. So some attacks could occur during the daylight. We quite frankly expect there to be a little bit of a lull in between. Sam, also a government source I talked to just a few moments ago confirmed for us that, in fact, here's the way this all came down, the attack. CIA Director George Tenet went to the White House yesterday afternoon and briefed President Bush, told him that they knew where Saddam and some of his top military leaders were, told him that they thought that he would be in this position, in this house in Baghdad for quite some time, and they hurriedly changed a battle plan that had been carefully laid out and carefully orchestrated to add this one particular target in to hit it in Baghdad. Now, we now know that the target was hit with about 3 dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from cruisers, destroyers, and submarines in both the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Also, 2 F-117s dropping EGBU 2,000-pound bunker buster, boy, that's a mouthful, bunker buster 2,000-pound bombs. They are guided by global positioning satellite systems, also the Tomahawk cruise missiles guided by the global positioning system also. Now, you saw Saddam Hussein making his speech on Iraqi television after all of this, and I was told by this official that it is likely that they may have missed him, but here was the caution. Don't completely rule it out for a couple of reasons. Number one, this was clearly a tape. There is no reference in Saddam Hussein's address to the events that just happened. Even though there's a dated reference in it, it could clearly have had a date added into it. And you know, they wouldn't rule out a double. They said it probably is Saddam, but note that he was wearing glasses. He doesn't usually wear them. He was reading off of a steno pad, flipping the pages up as he read. He typically works off of a teleprompter, a very slick presentation, and this was not a slick presentation. It was sort of slow and steady. They say don't rule out a body double. They didn't believe that's the case. They believe he likely is still alive, but don't base your decision that he escaped on the tape that you saw on the air of him making the address. So still out there looking, battle damage assessment yet to come when the sky's clear in there and they can get the U-2 spy planes over or take a look down from one of the satellites and get a little closer look at it. But hard to tell exactly. Saddam Hussein is known to have had a number of body doubles, known to have spent the nights in different places, very often during the last war, escaped any damage or any harm by staying in private residences instead of staying in his palaces. So that is the way the operation came down, Sam. That's what we're told by a highly placed government source.
Well, and Carl, what some may find a rather cruel and odd twist in all of this is the question now, and we've been asking this question about Osama bin Laden, is he indeed alive? And now after this initial attack and the videotape that we have seen within the past few hours of Saddam Hussein, that question arises again for him. So now we are all debating whether or not Saddam Hussein is alive, whether or not Osama bin Laden is alive. It is rather an interesting twist on this whole story, this whole war, is it not?
It is, and I would suggest to you that it is extremely difficult to pin something like that down. Go back to the operation in Panama and Manuel Noriega and how difficult it was to pin him down. Smaller country, less people, a lot of forces in there. Forces that had known that area for years and years. The U.S. had a base in Panama. Still very difficult to pin Noriega down. Extremely difficult to that pinned Saddam Hussein down. He stays moving from house to house.
Carl, when you describe that visit by George Tenet to the White House a week prior to the bombing, it gives you an indication the level of intelligence, and surprising maybe for many in the United States, the level of intelligence that the U.S. has on the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden. It sounds as if the special ops forces are alive and really kicking with inside Iraq's borders.
They are indeed the Special Operations Forces and some special units that operate with the Central Intelligence Agency. I will tell you from a perspective, at one point many years ago, the CIA, the current head of the CIA at that time, and I believe it was Admiral Stansfield Turner, decided that the way to go with gathering intelligence was to use satellites, overhead imaging, U-2 planes, SR-71s, and that human intelligence was not that valuable. And they found during the Iran hostage-taking that human intelligence was extremely valuable, and they needed to restructure it and recreate it. And the intelligence community has been trying to rebuild that intelligence component for some time. You may see some of this at work here. You may see U.S. operatives operating in that area, but suffice to say that the intelligence operation, the special forces, people like the Black Berets, people like the Delta Force that no one in the military will ever acknowledge exists, but in fact it does, SEAL Team 6, the Special SEAL Team units, they have people all over. They've been in there for some time, and they've been operating for some time covertly. So someone, you're absolutely right, is tracking Saddam Hussein, has a pretty good idea where he is, and actually that may be the indication of whether the person that they thought was Saddam Hussein was in that bunker, escaped alive. Is that same intel that pointed where he was may ultimately be able to tell you that they did or did not get him.
Carl, finally, I want to ask you this, because we all expected to see the shock and awe campaign right off the bat. That clearly did not happen. Is there any indication that A, it will indeed take place, and B, when it might take place?
I think you will see a shock and awe campaign at some point, but one of the characteristics of this is the military is trying to move forward and not telegraph what it's going to do. So all the public information that they leaked out, if you will, about the way this campaign was going to go down, that the first strike would be just a big bang with everything being knocked down, you know, and actually there was part of a plan that was put into effect today. It wasn't just this place in Baghdad they took down. They also hit targets in northern, southern, and western Iraq. They took down some airfield areas. They took down some units that were in there, more radar sites. So a strike was apparently planned for this evening, or last evening, local time here in Washington, that took place. And what they did after CIA Director Tenet briefed President Bush on the possibility of getting Saddam Hussein is that they diverted a couple of resources. They diverted a few Tomahawk cruise missiles and the F-117s, easily redirecting the F-117s, and with the Tomahawk cruise missiles, fairly easy to redirect them now because you program GPS coordinates in them, latitude, longitude of the target, and fire it in that direction. So they reprogrammed and sent them in to hit this particular bungalow in Baghdad to take him down. So something was in the works already, and it wasn't that big splash that we had been looking for.
All right, Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon, thank you very much for getting us up to date. A number of developments to report for you at this hour. Number one, from the State Department, there is another warning that is going out to U.S. citizens here and particularly abroad about the potential for terrorist attacks with regards to this. Also, I wanted to throw this in, Bianca. Pakistan, once again, we know Pakistan has been opposed, but they are reiterating that from Reuters. They do not support this war with Iraq. They are now pushing for peace. And of course, there has been a call by a number of officials to have another meeting at the United Nations with regards to what is now a war in Iraq.
That is Pakistan's reaction. This just came in from the president of Greece, saying he regrets that this could not have been solved peacefully.
We will see that for the rest of this day, I am sure, more reaction.
And before all of this started, all of the bombing started, there was a warning given to Israel by the United States. Secretary of State Colin Powell telephoned Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon saying that the bombing was going to start. He told him that there was a specific target that was going to be attacked in Baghdad before the more comprehensive attack started. So Israel did have warning of this before it all started. Keith Miller joins us now live from our Tel Aviv bureau. And Keith, we're talking about a place that was hit by 39 Iraqi Scud missiles during the Gulf War. How are the people there preparing this time around?
Well, they're very well prepared, in fact, Bianca. I mean, this country has been gearing up for this particular conflict for for, I would say, months. In fact, every person in the country, all 6 million of them, each have their own individual gas masks. They were warned about 24 hours ago to seal rooms within their homes using masking tape and plastic sheeting. And at the same time, they've also set up civil defense units within the, well, I should say, throughout the entire country to deal with any eventuality. At the same time, they've got extraordinary air defenses here, something called the Arrow missile killer, which is an Israeli weapon which intercepts rockets almost above the Earth's atmosphere. That's backed up by American manned Patriot missile batteries. They're located in all the major population centers. So I think many people in Israel probably had a pretty sleepless night last night once they understood that the war had in fact gone underway. Nothing here, no air raid sirens, no indication that there was any sort of Scud attack imminent in any way. Today, in fact, the government telling everybody, go about your life as normal. The schools are open. Some children are attending schools, not many. And the ones that are attending school are carrying their own individualized gas masks with them just for precautions. So you have basically a nation very well prepared for any eventuality. At the same time, very nervous. Iraq is not that far away and remains a very critical enemy of Israel. Bianca?
About the everyday person, how he and she is prepared, carrying gas masks around, sadly become a way of life there. And you also talked about this Arrow missile killer system. That's a weapon. What about ground troops? Any reservists called up, prepared just in case?
Well, they had the reservists called up, but not primarily in terms of ground troops, but certainly to aid in any civil defense actions necessary in case of an attack. Also, they called up reservists to man those missile sites, backup crews, if you will, for those as well. But the civil defense units here in Israel, I mean, they've had 50 years of experience. This is an ongoing situation in this country. In fact, if there was any threat to Israel that I would think would be perhaps the most prominent, would be a terrorist attack coming somewhere from Islamic Jihad or Hamas, one of the more radical Islamic groups. They always pose a threat to Israel and have for the last 28 months more than 700 Israelis killed in suicide bombing attacks from the Islamic groups. So I think probably their biggest concern is in fact a terrorist strike in Israel. Of course, it would be ongoing with the conflict with Israel, but I suspect what you'd have is some sort of declaration that this was for the people of Iraq, somehow piggybacking onto that conflict, a conflict that is ongoing here in Israel.
Keith, if you could discuss this, we saw Israel kind of stay by the sidelines during the '91 war, but this time around they have said they do have the right to retaliate. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think they would always have to say that just to show that they're a sovereign state and that they are not a puppet of the United States. At the same time, I can assure you there is tremendous pressure on the part of the U.S. government to keep Israel out of this conflict. They don't want the world, which as you've just been reporting, which is already predominantly opposed to the American invasion of Iraq. They don't want this to be seen as an American-Israeli alliance against an Arab state. So I think there's a lot of behind-the-scenes pressure on the government here not to react. I will say, however, that if this country is hit with a chemical or biological agent by Iraq, I'm not sure how the United States will try to or will be able to contain the Israeli government from some sort of retaliation. I think at the same time we should remember back in '91, 39 Scud attacks, the Israelis just kind of swallowed it. They kept their mouths shut. They kept their fingers off the buttons. No retaliation in that particular conflict, again, because of American pressure not to give the impression that this is some sort of Israeli-American initiative against an Arab state.
Okay, Keith Miller reporting for us from our NBC Bureau in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much.
Just about 3 hours after the first strike was launched in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein appeared on Iraqi state TV, and he said during his speech, and I quote, "The criminal little Bush has committed a crime against humanity." That was during the speech that we heard, and he attacked, of course, the President of the United States. He said, of course, that Iraq would be victorious. With that, we want to head now to Washington, D.C., and Jessica Yeldon, who joins us right now. And Jessica, I want to tick off a few of the countries. We know Germany, Russia, France, of course, so they've been opposed to this from the get-go. But we're getting word now from a number of countries across the globe responding. China, Pakistan, Indonesia, Greece, just among a few, who are condemning all of this, and some even calling for a special meeting at the United Nations. What does the White House have to do on this day, in addition to running a war, in terms of trying to patch up this situation?
Sam, you hit on the head. For the White House, there is a second battle. Of course, their focus first will be on the war itself and military action. But the president will also have to focus on the fight over public opinion, both at home and abroad. You mentioned all those countries that have denounced this war effort. So first, let's look overseas. Now, the president demonstrated just how severely concerned he is about international opinion in his address to the nation last night. If you take a look at the tape of his address, it was in the first 20 seconds of that speech that he underscored international support. He said that 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of their naval and air bases to help with intelligence, etc. His message here that despite international opposition, the U.S. is not going it alone. Now, you ticked off the list of some of those countries that have already say they fiercely oppose this fight. And the president will have a struggle. He will have to win these countries back over by showing that Saddam Hussein is, in fact, the threat that the president has said he is all along. Specifically, he will have to show that Saddam does have the weapons of mass destruction that the Bush administration has been claiming he has. The president will need that to justify this war. And so that will be a clear priority for U.S. troops if they are able to overtake Baghdad, if and when that happens. Now, that's overseas. Back at home, though, there is another fight for public opinion, a message to the American people. In the lead up to this struggle, there has been an assumption that this will be a quick battle and painless for folks here in the United States. The president tried to lower expectations there, saying the terrain in Iraq is hard and the campaign could be, quote, longer and more difficult than people expect. In other words, don't plan for this to be over by the end of the weekend. The president also reminding people the U.S. presence in Iraq will last well beyond the battle stages. So at the White House, there'll be many calls, and in the days and perhaps weeks ahead, they'll have to maintain a big public relations push throughout Operation Iraqi Freedom to get their message out. Sam?
Well, quite clearly heading into this conflict, of course, the polls were very much in favor of the president and the White House, but time is not on their side. The more time passes in this conflict, of course, they suspect that support will erode. Let's talk about the members of Congress. There are some who are suggesting that no war was officially declared by Congress here. That may be a violation of the Constitution, some may argue. And then there are those in Congress who are a bit critical. Senator Kerry, of course, who intends to run for president, has been critical. Jessica, are you aware of anybody in Congress, any members of Congress who may have been brought on board prior to this? Do you know if the president made any phone calls?
As far as the phone calls go, we understand the only person who actually received a phone call notifying them that the attack was going to happen isn't even a U.S. citizen. It was Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain. So while many members of the Republican Party have been in close consultation with the president, as far as we know, no specific calls to members of Congress. But the president was required to send a letter to Congress telling them that he planned to attack. And that letter went out. It's dated March 18th. And that was required under the terms of a resolution that Congress passed authorizing this war. And the president said, I'll just read you a bit of it. He said that he's determined that further diplomatic and peaceful means will not adequately protect the national security of the United States. That's his legal justification for this. You can bet this will play large in the presidential elections ahead. Already, 2 Democratic contenders have made statements. Representative Dennis Kucinich denouncing the war, saying that it is not justified, and Senator John Edwards speaking out in support of it. And I'm sure we'll hear much more from various members of Congress in the coming days.
Indeed, resolution or no resolution, you can bet constitutional scholars will be arguing this one for years. And you are very right about this, Jessica. This will be a political football come election time.
It sure will.
Okay, thanks so much for that. It is 19 minutes past the hour. Bianca?
All right, Sam. When we look at these attacks, we've seen them centering near Baghdad, also in the southern part of Iraq. Northern Iraq has been a big area of discussion in recent days, especially with Turkey's involvement in that area, seeing whether or not we could use airspace to enter Iraq through the north. Also, if we could ever get ground troops, more than 62,000 into northern Iraq through Turkey. Preston Mendahal joins us now from northern Iraq. Preston, what can you tell us of what's going on in that area of Iraq right now?
Bianca, the streets of northern Iraq are largely deserted right now. You might be able to see a bit behind me. The city we're in is about 30 miles from the front line between the Iraqi troops and the Kurdish opposition forces, a front line that has been there for a dozen years, very well established. What we have seen in the last few days, this is a war that the Kurds here, the minority in Iraq that occupy most of northern Iraq, it's a war that they have longed for many years, but also feared at the same time. There have been thousands of them leaving areas controlled by Saddam Hussein's forces and fleeing north to try and put some distance between them and any potential conflict. They also fear, of course, the Kurds, a chemical attack. One happened in 1988, a very well-known one in Halabja, in which 5,000 people were killed in one single attack. There were other similar ones as Saddam Hussein has sought to eliminate the Kurdish opposition over the years. Now, there are some developments here that we had expected once the bombs started falling, but obviously the decision to target Saddam Hussein early in this campaign and then a pause right now has meant that some of the developments we expected not happening right now, but let me go over with you some of the ones that we'll see probably when the brunt of the U.S. air assault and land invasion begins. Notably, based on their Gulf War experience, Kurdish military officials tell us that they would expect tens of thousands, potentially, of Iraqi soldiers in regular army divisions to surrender when the massive amount of bombs do start falling. That was the experience in 1991. They expect it to happen again. The front line I was describing to you between the Kurds forces and the Iraqi forces is largely manned on the Iraqi side by divisions of the Iraqi army, regular divisions, not the elite Republican Guard, but soldiers. There's a low level of morale. They're demoralized, not well nourished, not well clothed. It still is the spring here and quite cold. There have been reports of some of the Iraqi soldiers trying to get clothes from people who have been leaving Iraq. It's a fairly desperate situation, and for that reason, the Kurds here, the Kurdish military forces, believe that they will see those thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendering once the larger campaign begins. Now, along the front lines, also just across them, is the city of Kirkuk, about 60 miles from where I am. Kirkuk is the oil-rich city in Iraq's north, controlled by Saddam Hussein, but historically a Kurdish city. And it's a city where Kurds have been forced out of for years as part of a campaign by Saddam to Arabize Kirkuk and take control of it for himself and get rid of the Kurdish opposition. We would expect from sources we hear that special forces would go in and take Kirkuk and secure that right away in the next phase of a U.S. mission. Back to you.
Okay, Preston Mendenhall reporting for us from northern Iraq, an area full of Kurdish that have left that area because of fear. They know all too well what can happen, going back to their memories of 1988 when they were attacked by Saddam Hussein. Sam?
Bianca, 3:23 on the East Coast, 12:23 on this Thursday morning on the West Coast, and this just in from NBC's David Bloom. U.S. commanders now say that the real air war has not yet begun. They tell David that the cruise missile strike Wednesday night on the East Coast, and of course was Thursday morning in Baghdad, was just a precursor, preliminary. So again, confirming what we have heard all along from Qatar and of course from the Pentagon, that there is much more to come. Let's head now to our Middle East expert, Professor Walid Faris, who joins us now to talk more about this. Professor Faris says Saddam Hussein, no doubt you saw his speech. Very interesting discussion that took place here just a little bit ago about whether or not this tape is legitimate. And of course, we have talked, you and I remember the discussion about Osama bin Laden's tapes, whether they were legitimate, and now we are entering into this discussion. And I know that this is hypothetical, and maybe it's just something that we do at cocktail parties now. But whether or not this is real and whether or not he is alive after this initial bomb.
Well, with Osama bin Laden, it was where is Waldo? With Saddam Hussein, is he Waldo? That's the question today. Basically, the assumption I go with is he is still alive until proven dead, not the other way around. And Saddam Hussein has also another reason not to accept that a clone would appear. It's ego. He had eliminated so many people from the public scene so he could take over. So psychologically speaking, I would find it very difficult that he would accept the idea that a clone would take over. He would use those models to protect him on security level. But I would really doubt, psychologically speaking, and I may be wrong, that he would accept that somebody would go and take the lead.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard he's had like 3 or 4 body doubles that he uses very often. Is that true? And you talk a little bit about that. How realistic are they in terms of voice, appearance, so on?
Basically, the body doubles, as they are called, it's not just 3 or 4, there are even more than that, many more. In fact, they are not used for close-ups. It's not somebody who looks exactly like him who could lead meetings or have normal activities very close to camera. These are people who would basically drive or are escorted or are sent as decoys in convoys. Whenever he wants to leave his palace, 3 convoys would leave at the same time, and you have these decoys in these convoys. This is the real reason why he has all these models.
I heard a very interesting interview earlier tonight with General Norman Schwarzkopf, who indicated that at the end of the Gulf War in the early 1990s, that apparently Saddam Hussein had an airplane fueled up and ready to go. He was ready to fly out of that country and go into exile. What do you know about that?
Well, yeah, I've heard the same story. It was confirmed by others as well. Let me put it that way. Saddam Hussein today has a plane, has a train, has a tunnel, has all the connections to exit. This is not someone who would want to really die. He wants to project the idea that he would be a martyr, but at the last minute, what he hopes, some sort of ceasefire. He is surrounded in his palace in a city. It's the model of West Beirut and Arafat, and suddenly the United Nations finally arranged for a ceasefire, and that would be his honorable exit. He's not someone who is really going to go all the way to die for a regime that he has established.
Do you think under any circumstances he would leave that country?
2% when he will see defections in the beginning of the campaign and he gets real advice from his real allies across the Middle East and into Europe and Russia that we're not going to be able to do anything for you. 20% when large segments of Iraq would be freed or liberated in the north and the south, as I said earlier, when he is going to see large Iraqi cities with Iraqi flags, with Iraqi Arab and Muslim and Kurds and others, forming some sort of beginning of a cabinet and criticizing him, calling on the international community, on the United Nations, to basically try Saddam Hussein. This is the nightmare of Saddam Hussein, not shelling, not bombardment. And finally, 80% when he will be surrounded in his palaces, one of his palaces. At this point, he will make arrangements for his allies to basically put some pressure to find an exit for him at that point.
And Professor, I want to touch upon something that you and I talked about 45 minutes ago with regards to that videotape that we saw of his speech earlier, about 2 or 3 hours ago, as a matter of fact. You think this is him, and you think that he is pretty shaken up by this first attack?
Yes. I'm not the great expert in psychology of leaders, but when I look at this picture, first of all, someone said, you know, he doesn't wear glasses. In fact, maybe because now he needs to put his glasses, he basically needs to read. Usually everything is scripted before. This is his voice, Saddam Hussein's voice, and indeed, I can recognize that this is after a shock. I may be wrong, but this is after a shock. And what gave me the impression that it was the case, because this was broadcasted also on Al Jazeera, and after that, there were a number of ministers in his government really, really very upset and emotional, talking about, you know, attack against Saddam Hussein and the crime. You know, when they talk about the crime, they meant, you know, Saddam Hussein to be killed.
One quick question. I don't have a lot of time, but I've read something, and correct me again if I'm wrong about this man. He's a street fighter. He grew up on the streets. He knows how to duke it out a bit. Is that his history?
He's someone who's a survivor. There's always this
They cause damage. So, yeah, it's not something I want my wife and kids necessarily watching, but there you go.
Let me interrupt here. Don Teague is talking to our sister network, CNBC. And what you're seeing is the concern that they have missiles that are coming in. This is not unlike what happened in 1991. In fact, it is precisely the same thing that we saw in 1991 when Saddam would throw Scuds, which let's listen and see if we can hear this.
We could do about any impact if it were right here on top of us. But coming down in the city, you'll see us run pretty quickly for shelter. Thank you. You're welcome. All right.
That was Don Teague there. He was talking to our sister network, CNBC. We're going to go back there very shortly. I was saying that this is not unlike what happened in 1991 when at about this stage the Iraqis began throwing Scud missiles at Dhahran and at Riyadh, where U.S. forces were based. For the most part, you were pretty safe if he was throwing them at you because they had no sort of accuracy whatsoever, and never once was a chemical weapon attached. Obviously, people are very concerned about it, but so far of the missiles that have come in, there have been no chemical weapons used at all. And although precautions are necessary, alarm is something that is probably not needed at this point. Don Teague is joining us now. How are you faring there, Don?
We're doing okay. We obviously went back to the gas masks here just about 5 minutes ago because we had a citywide alarm, the air raid sirens, that by my count, I think it's about the 8th time we've gone through this since noon yesterday, Kuwait time. You know, we take these seriously because, as we have found out now, these sirens do, in some cases, signify actual missile launches. Fortunately, for the residents here in Kuwait, they've been intercepted by Patriot missiles in times past, but we haven't been given the all clear here yet. So, you know, we're going to do the thing and stay masked up here and just keep our eyes open and wait for that.
I understand. It was my understanding that the Patriots have not been terribly accurate. In 1991, they were not accurate much at all. I think there's been one that's knocked it down. Have they gotten better?
Well, you know, the Patriots here, they tell us, are the Patriot 3 missiles, which are an improved Patriot, and they work in a different way. There's software on board that allows them to actually triangulate, if you will, and meet an incoming missile in the air is much better. They also actually target that missile differently. The original Patriot was a proximity explosion. It gets somewhere in the area and it explodes, and you hope that the basically fragmentation takes out the missile. The Patriot they have here now, and the ones that we've seen scattered all around this country, is designed to be a direct hit. It sort of hits like a bullet, taking out that other missile that's incoming, and it's supposed to reach them much further out. So, you know, what we've seen, the military has confirmed a total of 3 incoming missiles over the last couple of days, and they say they shot down at least 2 of them and haven't determined how the other one came down, but the good news is no one has been impacted by those incoming missiles yet.
All right, Don Teague in Kuwait City. Do stay safe there, Don. And one can take heart in the knowledge that it's very difficult to disperse chemical weapons. They tend to land and not go very far, so this is not a simple technology. Unless you're able to explode it in the air over an area, it doesn't disperse very far. And there are a lot of people who don't think that Saddam Hussein, at least at this stage in fighting, would be willing to use chemical weapons because it would turn world opinion against him so strongly. Let us move from Kuwait City to what some refer to as the pointy end of the spear. It is the 3rd Infantry Division that drove out of Kuwait City and punched that hole out there using artillery fire to allow U.S. and British forces to move out, heading toward Baghdad and then also moving off in the direction of Basra, and they've been moving there very quickly. Our own David Bloom is right out there with them, and this is just how remarkable our own technology is as it catches up with the technology of the military. These are live pictures of as far forward a force as there is, I do believe, David. I mean, you're about right there on the edge, aren't you?
We are, Forrest. We're with the 315 Infantry of the 2nd Brigade of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, and these soldiers were literally the first ones to cross over into Iraq last night. The attack began with artillery around 8 p.m. our time. It's now coming up on about 9:30 in the morning here, so it's 13 and a half hours ago. Behind me are some of the soldiers who are in this infantry division. Guys, come over for just a sec. And these guys were among the first to actually head out into Iraq. Their mission, the artillery was hitting 2 observation posts. The idea was to knock out those observation posts because they didn't want the Iraqis to be able to get word back to Baghdad as to where the routes were that the U.S. forces were coming through. Tell me your name and where you're from.
Specialist Schultz, Lucas. I'm from La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Okay. And tell me about this mission.
It went pretty smoothly, I think. I think we did a pretty good job.
Now, you guys are infantry, and what you did was you sort of made a beeline for these observation posts, right? I mean, you set up kind of a blocking force so that other forces could then move in?
Roger. We cleared the way.
Okay. And tell me your name and where you're from.
David Dreyer from Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay, David. And tell me about the mission that you guys undertook last night.
Well, we just followed the artillery, and there's pretty much nothing left, and we just set up and let everybody pass through.
When you say there was nothing left, what David's saying is that there were these 2 large observation posts containing anywhere between 10 and 30 Iraqi soldiers apiece. And as I say, the mission of this lead element of the 3rd Infantry Division was, frankly, to wipe those soldiers out because they didn't want anyone making a phone call or anything like that back to Baghdad to say, hey, this is the route they're coming through, because obviously the routes are critical in terms of how they'll go up to Baghdad. Let me talk to one more soldier here. Tell me your name and where you're from.
Sergeant Kevin Blackman from Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay. And tell me about you're in this Humvee, right, with the machine gun on top, is that right?
Yeah, with the 3rd Military Police Company out of Fort Stewart. We're attached to the Bravo Company 315.
So tell me what your mission was last night and now today.
Just pretty much just go along with them and any possible enemy surrenderies, anything like that. We just kind of take control of them and take care of them.
But as I understand it, there wasn't anyone left to surrender, is that right?
To my knowledge, no.
Right. I want to introduce you to one more person here who's making the rounds here this morning. This is the chaplain for the 315, Steve Hommel, and he just happened to be walking by here talking to these soldiers. Tell me what you're doing in this situation now, chaplain.
Well, the main thing is just, going around, talking to the soldiers. We're all kind of experiencing it together and, getting through it.
You've got a unique perspective on this because you were in the 101st Airborne in the First Persian Gulf War, left to go to seminary school, then decided to come back into active duty. So you can not only talk to these men about their faith, but you can also talk to them about what it's like to be in combat.
Yeah, that's a big thing. The first time that I went in, I was an infantry sergeant. And, having gone through it once and coming back again, I don't have... those fears of the unknown. I mean, what do you really know about warfare if you haven't been there? Just the movies and your imagination. So one of the things I do is I tell the guys, it's not going to be as bad as you think it's going to be. Now, it's not going to be good, but it's not going to be as bad as your imagination can make it. And, trying to talk to them about just living one day at a time.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty much the consensus of all of us here who are combat veterans, talking to the guys who haven't been here before.
Chaplain Steve Hommel and the other guys, thank you all so very much. We appreciate it. So the spirits are pretty high here right now. As I say, they've encountered only light opposition thus far. There are 3 Iraqi army divisions here in southern Iraq. We're getting reports on the military radios that at least one of those Iraqi armor divisions has capitulated, signed the capitulation documents, surrendered, which, if accurate, and we have no reason to believe that it's not, clearly is what the U.S. military hoped for. That is that those regular army forces from Iraq would not be the ones to fight, that they would by and large be willing to give up, go back to their garrisons, put their vehicles in a circle to let them know that they're friendly, fly the white flag rather than the Iraqi flag. So for all those reasons, these guys, once the main elements of this force get in, remember the 3rd Infantry Division is 20,000 soldiers, 250 tanks, hundreds of Bradley infantry vehicles. Once those get in here, then this force will pick their routes and start heading north toward Baghdad, where they're likely to face more stiff opposition from the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard, which are right now in these belts encircling Baghdad. Forrest?
David, I'm intrigued by this report that you have that there are some surrenders. I believe, based on something that I had read that you had reported.
Forrest, I'm sorry if you're talking to me right now, but I've lost this sat phone IFB. I'm going to try to redial it, but I'll get back to you in a minute here.
All right. There goes David Bloom. This is what happens. We do love our technology, but sometimes it doesn't work as well as we would like. Let us check back in with Don Teague, who has been enduring the occasional siren. It's just part of life during war in a city like Kuwait City. Don, how's that gas mask? You got it off yet? There, Don Teague. I recognize you now.
Yes. What you're hearing there is the all clear siren. I would say we had the 9th air raid alarm that we've had since about noon yesterday, 8th or 9th. It's hard to keep track. And you know, we are following, you know, our SOP with NBC News, which is until we hear those all clears, or until our experts that we employ to come here with us and help us in a zone like this tell us to unmask. We put the masks on and we leave them on. So,
you should.
We've been going through.
And well, you should, Don. Although there are certain nerve agents which, if they touch your skin, kill you instantly. So there's that to think about.
Well, and we certainly know about that. We are undercover here. It's hard to tell from the way this shot is, but we do have a protective covering over us in this area. And if there were any impact, we have complete chemical suits that are here with us under this cover that we can put on and either stay here, or I'm about 20 feet from a hardened concrete shelter that I can then run into. So we're certainly aware of all of the intricacies of biological and chemical weapons that you could possibly face in a situation like this.
How are the good people of Kuwait City handling this new turn of events in their lives?
You know, it's really interesting. When I've been here for a little over 2 months, and when we arrived here, there was all of this talk about giving everyone in the city, well, the 2 million people in this country, gas masks issued by the government. I've seen one, and you know, I don't know of anyone other than the one person who came to show everyone that he had a gas mask. Everyone else, as we watch, first of all, I should tell you, it's very quiet on the streets in general. Not a lot of people out and about for obvious reasons, but during this last air raid siren, behind the camera, if you will, in front of me, I can see about a quarter of a mile away a cricket game underway in a dirt field, and they never slowed down. They sort of have this feeling that the U.S. troops and the Patriot missiles are going to protect this city no matter what, and some people are just going to go on about their lives, just never mind what risk there may be.
Well, the good news is we're going to go back to David Bloom and get some further confirmation about this, but there are a lot of surrenders that are going on of those Iraqi regular forces that are off to your north there, so perhaps you won't have to endure this too much longer. Don Teague, thanks for talking to us, Don. Hopefully, one hopes that David Bloom has been able to dial the sat phone and has us back. And David, are you there?
I hear you, Forrest. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. The question I was asking was about the reports of surrenders that you had heard. I had read the basis of another of your reports, which said it was the 11th Armored Division, and I had also read that the 12th had been negotiating surrenders. So I'd like to ask you whether you have heard that, and if true, those two together would constitute about 2/3 of the force there in the south.
Right. I got to put this the right way for us, because obviously there are things that we know that we can't report. But suffice it to say that there were entreaties to these forces even before the air war or the ground war began. And there were cues and indications from the commanders of some of these forces that they would be more than willing to sign the capitulation documents once the armed forces of the United States started to roll into Iraq and once the hostilities commenced. I can't independently confirm to you the report about the 12th. I know that the report about the 11th, I have absolutely no reason to doubt that it's true. But again, this is not inconsistent with what these forces thought they would expect to face here in southern Iraq, in that, remember, the regular army divisions of Iraq are conscripted conscripted, if I could say that word, B, very poorly maintained in terms of training, in terms of the money that they're given, et cetera, et cetera. So there was an expectation, if you will, on the part of the American forces, certainly a hope on the part of the American forces, that they would be more likely to surrender. Now, having said that, it's the Republican Guard, and you don't want to belabor this or beat the drumbeats too loudly, but the Republican Guard is encircled around Baghdad, and they have large numbers of tanks, heavy artillery, a much more formidable force for the Americans to face. They still think that for example, the range on their tanks is far better for the Americans. They're not, if you would say, worried about these forces, but they're much more formidable opposition. And of course, the Special Republican Guard is the one that's actually inside Baghdad, much tighter quarters. So to say that these regular army forces, or at least some of them, are capitulating, are surrendering, are choosing not to fight is A, not a surprise, and B, doesn't take away the much more daunting mission that these soldiers might face in the next couple days.
Well, indeed, and here's the problem about all of this, David. You recall back in 1991, the forces were literally surrendering just as fast as they could find the Americans. I even had some surrender to me because they were just looking for anybody who looked Western. If you get this many people who are surrendering, that in itself is a problem, which is why the U.S. has been saying perhaps their commanders could keep their sidearms and they could just march those guys back to the barracks and have a seat till this is all over. So how are they handling it?
You're exactly right there, Forrest. In fact, if I was back inside the M88 that we're traveling in, I would show you the capitulation form, both in Arabic and in English, which the commanders have to sign. And one of the things is that those commanders become responsible for those forces. Yes, there's a small U.S. armored force that guards them, that watches over them. That what they tell them to do is to put their vehicles, I'm just going to use my foot here, they put their vehicles in a square, point their gun turrets in, march their soldiers back into the barracks, and what they're told is, look, as long as you guys don't do anything, we're not going to fight you. If you make any sort of offensive maneuver whatsoever, we're going to unleash the Apaches, we're going to unleash the F-16s, we're going to unleash the artillery, we're going to unleash the tanks. So once you sign this document, you've capitulated. Now, I'll tell you another thing about what you alluded to in terms of the surrenders. What they've done is, A, they've beefed up the military police. They've also set up enemy prisoner of war camps inside of Iraq. They've established those so that they can flow those enemy prisoners of war into those camps much more methodically, much more organized fashion than they did in the first Gulf War. And in addition to that, some of the most heavily armored of the American forces are going to try to avoid those garrisons, etc., and move through other routes so that they don't have to get confronted with having to deal with those prisoners of war.
It's really interesting, and it's an indication of the, I don't mean to be rude, but the disdain that the United States has for these regular forces, because they're going to leave them essentially to their rear and drive on and not particularly worry about them, which under ordinary circumstances might not be the best policy.
That's right. I mean, obviously, with, for example, 20,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, they feel like they can leave enough of a force behind so that they can safeguard themselves. And remember, what they're going to do is they're going to have the soldiers in one place and their weapons in another place, perhaps a couple miles away, so that any move that they would make from one garrison to where their weapons and their vehicles are stored would be evident to the American soldiers there. But you're right. Having said that, what they want to do is not get distracted by those regular Army forces. They want to just keep plowing on toward Baghdad, confront what they see as the crown jewel of the Iraqi military, such as it is, wipe that out, and if they do that, they believe that they'll accomplish their mission, which is the collapse of this regime.
Yeah, my guess is they could leave 5 guys there to guard 200,000, and they'd probably be just fine. The ones that I talked to, I remember I talked to one who had surrendered, and he actually was a medical student in Chicago, and he had flown back to Iraq and got caught and was conscripted and sent up to the front to go live underneath the rain of rolling thunder from the B-52. So he was so thrilled to see the Americans, he was practically dancing. And I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you can say conscripted better than I can. Second of all, Forrest, what I would tell you is that just to add to that story, some of these Iraqi soldiers were trying to surrender to the American forces even before the war began. They went up to the Kuwaiti checkpoints, were told, look, we're not going to let you come into Kuwait. Once the hostilities begin, you can surrender, not before. So clearly there are some forces that are eager to surrender, but I mean, not to belabor this point, but I don't think we want to make too much of this. There are still vital missions that, for example, the 3rd Infantry Division has to undertake. There are still, major targets of opportunity and more formidable forces that they could face. So while the first few hours of this ground war are going perhaps as best as could be expected, we don't know what lies ahead.
Oh, you have to agree about that. I mean, the question never was what was going to happen there in the desert in the south. We knew that the regular army was going to roll over. Ultimately, it is going to come to that point where you have to invest Baghdad, and assuming that there are no surrender talks, and one hopes that there will be, that's what it's really going to come down to. It's going to come down to what those Special Republican Guard forces do, whether they fight to the end or they don't.
And what they're hoping to do, Forrest, is to wipe out, in as much as they can, the major weaponry of the Iraqis, so that their ability to defend even Baghdad would be highly constrained. That's why these forces are moving as fast as they are. That's why they're moving into Iraq on such short notice, picking up the pace of the ground war, if you will, because of the two events, both the target of opportunity in terms of the Americans striking the military leadership targets, perhaps even Saddam Hussein, and then, of course, the Iraqi response with the Scud or El Samud missiles. That picked up the pace of the ground war, but they're clearly right now where they want to be, and the issue is how fast do they get up toward Baghdad and confront those other more formidable forces.
I have some friends who are in the 101st Airborne, and as you know, they are some guys who are trained to literally do that house-to-house fighting, which is going to be necessary in urban warfare. And as you know also, David, the technological advantage that the United States enjoys when you're in a clear playing field as you are now is lost once you're up inside an urban area. Have you talked to some of the men there about that circumstance and how they feel about the possible battles that may come?
We have, Forrest, and let me say a couple things about that. First of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, keep in mind, this is the only tank battalion in the Persian Gulf region for the United States. I mean, this is what they call the Iron Fist. But tanks don't work nearly as well in urban environments as they do out here in the open desert. This is ideal, perfect tank country. Once they move into the major cities, once they would be forced to move into Baghdad, they would confront a much more difficult situation. Now, having said that, what they've been doing out here for the last couple months, and we've been coming back and forth from the States out to Kuwait to watch them, is they've been doing what they call the MOUT training, which is the urban warfare training. They set up little mini cities. They went through and they attacked them. They used the tanks to block, and they use the Bradleys to come in. So they've been practicing this warfare. There are other troops that can do this as well. So they're prepared for that contingency. Clearly, that's not what these forces want. I mean, if you ask them, do you want to be fighting from building to building in Baghdad, the answer is no. But they don't expect that that's going to be the case anyway. I mean, what they would far hope happens is that they can hit strategic targets in Baghdad and, again, cause the collapse of the regime. They stress over and over again they don't want some fight with the Iraqi people. They don't even want to fight with the Iraqi army. They don't even want to fight with the Republican Guard or the Special Republican Guard if they'll lay down their arms. But the way that they hope to avoid that is to hit those strategic targets in Baghdad, cause the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime, and rob them of the will to fight. That's the one thing that you hear again and again from these forces, is so that they don't have to have some either A, siege of Baghdad, or B, onslaught of Baghdad, both of which the U.S. almost certainly would win, but maybe at a higher casualty rate than certainly the Americans or the Iraqis would want to see.
Well, a couple of things. One intelligence source has said this evening, David, that there is at least a suspicion that the Iraqi leadership has lost control of the command and control, which would at least help explain some of the paralysis. Additionally, I've got former Marine Major Jack Stradley, who's a military analyst here and who knows more than both of us put together and a lot more than that about military tactics. So, Jack, let me ask your opinion of what we've been jawboning about. What do you see as the problems that lie ahead?
Well, obviously things have gone very well to this point, and that would concern me or any commander out there. If things are going too smoothly, you're waiting for the hammer to fall. So far things seem to be going well, but the fight lies ahead, as you've already pointed out, around Baghdad as they get closer to the Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard.
What's the job of the 3rd Infantry here at this point? They're clearly not going to be moving into the city, but they are going to be critical to investing it.
Correct. I think, you know, speculation on my part, but I imagine their mission is to move up close to Baghdad, set up strong points around the city, maybe engage the Republican Guard out of the city if they'll come out and fight, and set up those support areas so that probably limited objective raids can then be conducted in Baghdad if that becomes necessary, and support those kinds of operations, the infantryman on the ground there.
David, I could be wrong about this. Perhaps my memory fails as I totter into my old age, but I believe it was the 3rd that did that remarkable Hail Mary back in 1991 that Norm Schwarzkopf called for, as just this incredible fast run all the way around the Iraqi forces. Am I right? David, did you hear the question that I asked you?
No, I'm sorry, Forrest. I didn't hear you. I was talking to one of your producers. Tell me again what you're saying.
Forgive me. I said I could be wrong about this, but as I recall, it was the 3rd Infantry that did that remarkable Hail Mary maneuver back in 1991, which was an incredibly fast, literally just a run, so that their logistical tail had all manner of problems. It was it not?
It was. I mean, they went by a different name then. It was the 24th Infantry Division, but it's the same group. That was commanded by General Barry McCaffrey. This is commanded by General Buff Blunt, but it's the same, you know, it's the same elements. In fact, the 3 task force commanders that we're out with here are all Persian Gulf veterans from that renamed 24th, now part of the 3rd Infantry Division. And what they made was what you'd call the big left hook to sweep around the Iraqi forces and surprise them. And these forces are clearly capable of doing that. That's why they're here, basically, is because they can be such a fast-moving force. I mean, the tanks for us can drive at up to 55 to 60 miles an hour across the desert. They're not going to go that fast. They'd outrun their supply lines, but clearly the tanks and the Bradleys can race ahead, and they clearly are much faster than the other trailing vehicles, the Humvees, the fueling trucks, the medics, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, a couple of interesting things. In this case, they don't have to worry about the logistical problems so much. They can just let the tail keep up with them as they're moving along. That's not a problem. And I mean, it's fair to say they don't really have a problem with any Iraqi tanks either. They can stand off and drop anything that's anywhere near. I think they've got a range of about, what, 2 miles?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's the tremendous advantage that the U.S. has. I mean, the most sophisticated Iraqi tank is the T-72, and frankly, I mean, it could pose some danger, but it does not stack up to the M1A1, the Abrams tank that the Americans are using. And basically, that's a function of old NATO versus Soviet doctrine. The NATO strategy was to engage the Soviet forces from longer ranges. The Iraqis have the Soviet tanks. The Americans obviously have their tanks. They're much longer range. They're much more powerful. They're much more heavily armored, which is why they believe that they can take on these heavily armored Iraqi divisions and succeed if indeed it comes to that.
Yeah, you're talking about, when you say a T-72, you're talking about an old Soviet tank, and I'm assuming that they probably have problems even getting parts for them at this point. But it raises a fair question, which is, and I'm always curious to ask this of commanders, what is it, given all the things that we've been talking about, that keeps them awake at night? Where do they see the problems?
And are you still talking to me, Forrest? I'm sorry.
I was, David. I was asking, if you've asked that question, what is it that keeps commanders awake at night? What problems do they actually worry about?
Well, one of the things is certainly the possibility of a chemical, gas, or biological attack. I mean, clearly that's been a concern to these forces. That's why we're in what they call MOP 1 with the chem suits on, not the gas masks, not the boots, not the gloves, but certainly the chemical suits. And obviously I got my gas mask right here. So A, that's a concern. Although you alluded to this before, when you were talking about Kuwait City, a force like this that's moving along, and we're stopped right now because the other elements of the force are catching up with this. But I mean, by and large, this force will be rolling along, and a force that's moving along is very hard to hit with artillery strikes. I mean, clearly, especially given, as you said, the inaccuracy of the Iraqi missiles, their artillery is a little bit more accurate, but a force that's rumbling along, very difficult, especially with these desert winds in terms of that. I mean, obviously, one of the other things they worry about is their supply train in terms of the fuel. These Abrams and these Bradleys consume a lot of fuel. I think that it's about 7.5 miles to the gallon or something like that. I mean, they burn a lot of fuel as they're rumbling through the desert. So you got to keep your fuel trucks up. What they've got is they've got the smaller 2,500-gallon fuelers, which can keep up with the Abrams and the Bradleys. And then they've got the 5,000-gallon tanks, which come up beside those, refuel the 2,500s, and then the 2,500s go and catch up with the Abrams and the Bradleys. So those are two of their concerns. And then obviously the fact of the matter is, there are, as I keep saying, large Iraqi tank divisions to the south of Baghdad, which some force is going to have to confront. And so the question is, is this force one of those that confronts those? And are they up to that challenge? They're clearly not concerned about their training. They're not concerned about their equipment. They're not concerned about their morale. They're not concerned about the ability of the U.S. forces. They've got not only these formidable ground forces, but they also have air support from the A-10, the Thunderbolts, better known as the Warthogs, which can loiter over the skies and do with their Gatling guns and missiles very close air support, knocking out those Iraqi tanks. They've got the Apache attack helicopters, which can also fire the Sidewinder missiles. They've got F-15s in terms of air-to-air battles, which are not likely to come because the Americans, frankly, control the skies, at least as far as we can see, but also the F-16s, which can do the air-to-surface attacks. So it is a very daunting task. I don't know if you were listening to us earlier. We were talking to Sergeant Major Bob Gallagher, who's one of the real stars of this 3rd Infantry Division. He's a former Ranger, and you'll recall in Black Hawk Down, he was one of the ones who led the elite Rangers in to rescue those downed helicopters. And he said to us, good thing the Iraqis are surrendering. They didn't have any choice. Now, clearly, that's not going to be the case all along. And as the military commentator who you were talking to, voiced the concern, you don't want these forces to become too upbeat, too complacent. They're not. They're just positioned right now, ready for their next task as the rest of this force rolls in.
I just want to tell you, you mentioned the Warthog, which is one of the ugliest planes ever built.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I lost you once again here, so I'm going to redial.
All right, well, we've lost David, and we're about to lose the hour here, so we will pause. But thank you. That is, of course, David Bloom, who is really in a remarkable position. Jack Stradley sitting here beside me to be able to see this war as it is prosecuted. And I was saying that the Warthog is an incredibly ugly plane, and it is much maligned. But I fell in love with this plane in 1991 when I was standing across with some Special Forces guys from an artillery battery. And they still use the old tactic of trying to walk toward you, which is they fire at you and it misses, and then they sort of re-ratchet, and then they try to walk toward you. And we're standing there eating some fruit salad, waiting to see if they were going to hit us. And they had called in a Warthog, which comes drifting in like the ugliest butterfly you've ever seen, throws off a little chaff, comes back around, smashes the artillery battery in 2 seconds, and then drifts on home again. And at that point, I fell in love.
Well, a lot of people are in love with that airplane. It's literally a flying tank. It's heavily armored. It carries a lot of munitions, and it's designed for this kind of warfare. Like you said, it can take a lot of incoming fire and still give better than it takes.
Jack, are you surprised by how this war is faring at this point? I mean, we were all sort of poised and on our toes, waiting for shock and awe, and it comes in on little cat feet.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think that maybe the target of opportunity, going for the leadership, that opportunity that presented itself on the first night, the administration took that chance, fired some Tomahawks in there, dropped some bunker busters in there, and then decided we've got nothing to lose by kind of waiting or going slow and see what the effect was. And if, in fact, we did decapitate the regime and they capitulate in the next few days, then we were very fortunate.
It's clearly what they're doing, and what a surprise it was. David, I hear you are back with us, and we have time for just one last question, which is about your welfare. I'm curious how the rhythm of this is going and how much you and the men you are with are able to get some sleep and get some food and to stay rested as you move toward what is clearly going to be a much more stressful environment up around Baghdad.
It's difficult to get much sleep in a moving M88, I can tell you that. But having said that, we cut a few hours of sleep because, as I said, because these guys were the lead element of this force, we left earlier than everyone else. But as a consequence, we stopped earlier than everyone else as they sort of grabbed this foothold out here in the desert. So when we stopped, we tried to catch a couple hours of sleep. Basically, you're kind of sleeping kind of knotted up in a position like that, but it's better than no sleep at all. As far as eating, we're eating the MREs, the meals ready to eat, which, you know, frankly aren't that bad. Maybe if you're back in the States and have the option of some home cooking or a restaurant meal, you choose that instead. But out here in the desert, it beats the alternatives. And frankly, I found that the vegetarian meals contain a lot of fruit, which is always nice when you're out here in the desert. We're getting plenty of water, and the fact of the matter is, for us, is that I said this earlier. We're journalists. We're here to do our job. There's a certain degree of detachment that you have to have in that role because, well, it's easy to report on the U.S. military in this situation when things are going well. If things go poorly, we're going to have to say that as well and lay that out as explicitly as we are telling the good story right now. But having said that, these soldiers are taking good care of us. I mean, they've wrapped us in their warm embrace, and as a consequence, we're very well provided for. We're very well taken care of, and we definitely feel a kinship with these guys, even as much as there is that obvious professional distance that you try to maintain. Forrest?
Well, David, as you know, these are good and honorable men, and they are the best of us, and you are in good hands. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to do some recaps here as we move toward the top of the hour, but I thank you. I wish you Godspeed, and you stay safe with all the men out there.
Thanks, Forrest. Take care.
Let me just bring you up to date on where things are at this point. As you can see, the 3rd Infantry Division is moving right along at a pretty fast clip, heading toward Baghdad. Other forces have moved toward Basra, which is a Shia area that had been put down back in 1991 by Saddam Hussein in pretty powerful way. We are hearing from a British military spokesman that coalition forces have now taken control of the Al-Fa Peninsula. That wasn't too hard to do. They are making significant progress in their efforts to capture Basra itself. Bob Arnott told us that there was some fire that had been taken on there, and Jack Stradley, some Marines involved in that. So that is an actual fight that's been going on. But on the whole, this is being prosecuted in a way that the Americans must feel awfully good about. And remember, they are watching very carefully these possible surrender talks with high-ranking members of the Republican Guard, and we will very much like to see how that turns. But for now, I am Forrest Sawyer, heading toward 2 a.m. East Coast time, broad daylight in Iraq. We will be following this 24 hours a day. Do stay with us. For now, this is MSNBC.
Good morning to all of you on the East Coast. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm Alex Witt with our MSNBC continuing coverage of Target Iraq. 11 p.m. Good evening to those of you on the Pacific Coast. We are taking a look right now at a live picture of downtown Baghdad. It is now 10 a.m. their local time. There you are seeing some movement on the streets there, though certainly not what one would expect to see under normal circumstances inside of Iraq. The capital city there of that country, some people going about their daily business and trying to have some sense of normalcy to their lives, but it certainly is not as crowded as one would assume at 10 a.m. on a weekday Friday. We also have a picture there of David Bloom of NBC News. He has been spending the better part of our evening with us. He is traveling there with the 3rd Infantry Division. They have now moved from their former base in Kuwait through across the border into the southern part of Iraq there in the desert. David, we will be speaking with you, but can you give us any sense of your location at all there, about how long you've been on the move there once you got into Iraqi territory?
Well, the attack began, the ground war, at 8 o'clock local time last night, which is noon on the East Coast, 9 a.m. on the West Coast, with about 30 minutes of artillery strikes. Then we moved into Iraq, across the Kuwaiti berm, through an electrified fence that had been cut, and then also through the Iraqi berm. We moved up to a forward position here in southern Iraq. That's about all I can say about where we are. And basically what we're doing is we've sort of grab the foothold here for the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, and then the rest of the troops are going to roll out of Kuwait and are in the process of doing that right now toward this location. When they get here and the force forms up, then they'll make some decisions about what routes they take up to Baghdad, if indeed that's where they're going, and certainly we know that that's where they're going.
All right, David, we're going to come back to you in just one moment. First, everybody, we're going to get you caught up in the latest headlines. This is an Operation Iraqi Freedom, as we are doing every quarter hour for you round the clock. Beginning with this, U.S.-led forces continue their ground assault from Kuwait into Iraq after a series of artillery barrages. British troops have stormed the Al-Faw Peninsula at the head of the Persian Gulf. That is a key route for oil tanker traffic. You just heard my colleague, NBC's Forrest Sawyer, telling us that it is believed those British troops have now taken control of the Al-Faw Peninsula. Meanwhile, huge explosions, they are heard near the southern Iraqi city of Basra. U.S. officials are saying that intelligence strongly indicates that Saddam was still inside the bunker. Possibly he was injured. All of this when that bunker was hit on Wednesday night. And the Washington Post is reporting that U.S. officials knew that Saddam was making taped statements, all in anticipation of Wednesday's deadline. Pentagon officials say no hostile fire involved in the crash of a U.S. Marine helicopter, much like the one you're going to see shortly on your screen. It was a CH-46 Sea Knight. It went down in Kuwait, killing all 16 aboard. We're told there were 4 Americans believed to be Marines, also 12 British paratroopers, we believe. The Sea Knight was assigned to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. We are, of course, going to recap all the latest headlines on the Iraqi crisis for you every 15 minutes or so. You can also get the very latest anytime. To do that, go to the web, iraq.msnbc.com. All complete coverage for you, including the in-depth analysis, slideshows, video. You're going to find it all at iraq.msnbc.com. Just a short while ago, about an hour ago, the air raid sirens went off once again in Kuwait City. The fear a possible missile attack by Iraq could be a biological or chemical attack as well. Let's go straight to NBC's Don Teague. He is live in Kuwait City for us. Don, it's good to see you without the gas mask, Don, as we have come to see your familiar face behind that mask of late. Tell me what's going on right now.
Well, trust me, it's good to be here without the gas mask on as well, too. They gave us the all clear about 30 minutes ago. By my count, it's between the 8th and the 9th air raid siren that we've had in about 22 hours since around noon yesterday when this all started here. We've come to learn through experience that sometimes these air raid sirens just go away and then we don't hear the follow-up, and sometimes they did indeed signal the arrival of a missile inbound from Iraq. We know that the U.S. military has shot down at least 2 inbound missiles. We're not exactly sure what kind of missiles, but we are sure that it was Patriots that intercepted them successfully and brought them down. A 3rd missile that also was sent into this area, the military won't say, or they say they don't know specifically what brought it down, only that it also landed in an area away from any damage to people or equipment. But, you know, clearly we're taking all of these seriously. When the sirens go off, we're doing what we have been told to do and what the military does, which is mask up until we get an all clear that there are no chemicals involved.
Don, what about the people there in Kuwait City? Are they reacting as quickly and as fervently as you are there?
Well, that's hard to say. We don't see all of the people, but interestingly, the people we do see are probably people who either have a great deal of faith or simply have no masks and no way to protect themselves anyway, because during this last air raid, I watched a cricket game about a half a mile from here. I can see it from my vantage point. They never stopped playing cricket. I don't even know that anyone looked up to see if anything was flying over, but I've actually seen one Kuwaiti of the 2 million people in this country actually with a gas mask, so I don't know that there's a lot many can do about it. We saw over the past few days that some were preparing safe rooms in their house, doing what we've been told about with duct tape and putting up plastic sheeting and such, and indeed many people are not out on the streets. It's pretty vacant anywhere you go here, so we assume most people are at home and taking shelter there, but there are some people who are out just doing their thing, and the alarms don't seem to bother them at all.
Don, what about the weather, the heat there, and most importantly, perhaps those sandstorms? Have you been affected there by that?
No, you know, when the military is moving, they tend to sometimes create their own mini sandstorms because tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles kick up a tremendous amount of dust. There's also a low cloud ceiling today, which can cause problems for particularly helicopter pilots who are then forced to fly at lower levels. Generally in the military you fly at low levels anyway, but it takes away some of your options of getting up above the terrain, and if you combine sand with low clouds and some other issues, it can be difficult flying out there, particularly at night. Heat's not too big of a factor. It's shirt sleeve weather, but we had our jackets on until a couple of hours ago, so far the weather's really not that bad in that respect.
All right, thank you so much, NBC's Dawn Teague. We appreciate the live report. We will check in with you again there in Kuwait City. Now let's go back to NBC's David Bloom. He is traveling with the 3rd Infantry Division there. He is somewhere in the southern regions of Iraq, not too far beyond the Kuwaiti border, where he's been on the move, as he described, for probably about 14 hours now. Good, well, morning to you. I guess it must be approaching afternoon there. Well, no, it's shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, I believe, David. Tell me what is the latest from there. Describe the setting for us.
Well, Alice, I mean, we're out in the middle of the desert is basically the setting. What this is the lead element of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, which has about 20,000 soldiers in it. But we're with the 315 Infantry of the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd ID, which basically means these are the guys who were the first ones across the border into Iraq because, as I've said, their mission was to hit 2 observation posts, first with artillery, then with infantrymen, to make sure that they could not relay a message back to Baghdad as to where the 3rd ID would be rolling into southern Iraq from. Because obviously if they know where they're coming in from, they can anticipate what routes they might take, and this force obviously doesn't want them to do that. Right now we're stopped and basically waiting for the rest of the force to catch up with us, because obviously when you've got 6,000, 7,000 vehicles, 20,000 soldiers, it takes a long time to move them through those lanes into southern Iraq. So basically we're at a staging area here inside Iraq where the rest of the force will then catch up with us, and then depending upon what's going on in Baghdad with Saddam Hussein and his possible injury or, you know, maybe even death. We don't know what happened with him. But based upon what's happening on the ground, both in terms of Baghdad and in terms of the forces of the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard arrayed against them, then they'll make choices about how quickly they make a beeline for Baghdad.
David, how successful was that mission to clear the way? Was there any sort of significant encounters on behalf of those gentlemen there in the 3rd Infantry Division?
No, they've encountered only light opposition so far. What they were doing is they were hitting these 2 command posts, which each contained between 10 and 30 Iraqi soldiers. And, you know, not to be glib about it, but I mean, from their perspective, they wiped them out. And they felt like they had to do that because obviously they don't want a message getting relayed back to Baghdad as to their whereabouts. So they hit it hard with artillery for the first half hour. We were told, we were listening on the military radio, that they started the bomb. We could see the pictures, and maybe you guys have those and maybe you don't. We could see the artillery strikes going off in the distance, and we were told that at 8:07, 7 minutes later, those 2 command posts were wiped out. When we finally got up to them after the infantry soldiers had been there as well, all we saw was smoldering remains of those 2 command posts. So as I say, they've encountered only light opposition thus far. We're also hearing reports that the 11th regular Army division of the Iraqi Army has capitulated, has surrendered, and that other Iraqi regular Army divisions may be either contemplating or actively engaged in surrendering as well. If that's the case, and again, we don't know that definitively, we're hearing that over the military radio, but of course we're standing out here in the middle of the desert. But if that is the case, that's A, not surprising, because the regular Iraqi Army was not seen as a formidable fighting force, but B, it's also good news because obviously it suggests that some component of the Iraqi military structure is surrendering to the U.S. forces, which is exactly what they'd hoped for.
David, might some of those come and surrender to your group there, the 3rd Infantry Division, because you have moved into Iraq right now, and the reports are that Iraq's 11th Division there is moving southern, so it would seem that your 2 forces might meet up. Was that to be expected?
It could be. Again, I don't want to say too much about where they are and where we might be, But the fact of the matter is that, and I tried in my discussion with Forrest Sawyer a little while earlier to sort of allude to this as cryptically as I could. There were entreaties made long before this conflict began to those regular Army commanders to say, look, here's a capitulation document that you can sign, and if you sign this capitulation document, you won't have to fight. You can surrender. You can put your men in garrison. You can put your vehicles in a square. You can be separated from them, and we won't engage in hostilities. In fact, you can be in charge of your men, and we'll disarm you, obviously, but they're going to leave a very light force behind and keep on rolling. But whether this particular element of the 3rd Infantry Division has been in contact with them as yet, I can't say.
David, do you know how long you expect to be stationary there as you wait for the other troops to come and join you?
Interesting that you should ask that question, because I think that we're going to get rolling here momentarily. We'll try to show you some live pictures of that as we're moving along, but I got to wrap this up pretty quick, so if you've got maybe one more question, and then we've got to get going.
All right, David, one thing, how safe do you feel right now there in the middle of the desert? I see nothing but sand in the picture that we're looking at with you there on the phone to hear my questions. I've seen a couple of tanks off in the distance a bit, but they are not in a large grouping. So do you feel like you could be any kind of a target, or are you just so lone and isolated that absolutely not?
Yeah, I think that right now we feel pretty alone and isolated. I mean, having said that, there's artillery that they could certainly rain down upon us, which is notoriously inaccurate but still deadly if by happenstance it happens to hit you. There's also the possibility that that artillery could be loaded with chemical munitions, biological agents, which is why we're in these chem suits, what they call MOP-1, which means that you've got the chem pants on, you've got the chem top on, but you don't have your gas mask on, you don't have your boots on, you don't have your gloves on. So, I mean, it's certainly the case that there are potential threats out here. Having said that, we're comparatively safe. The fight that they anticipate fighting isn't here. It's much closer to Baghdad.
All right, NBC's David Bloom, you've said you have to get rolling there with the 3rd Infantry Division. We do appreciate your live report, David. Do stay safe, David, and we'll check in with you again as soon as we can.
Thanks, Alice.
All right, let's go now to Central Command, the very latest on the Marine helicopter crash and also the situation in the Iraqi city of Basra. To do that, we're joined by NBC's David Schuster. He is live at CENTCOM in Qatar with all of that. Good morning to you, David.
Alex, good morning. And the numbers seem to be changing.